In the next tutorial. So in the previous tutorial, I think we had discussed up until this functions, and we also had discussed the WP cache constant definition, WP set lang directory to set the path to the language files. We had discussed these files. What do these files do? And then we had discussed these functions. What do these functions do? And now we'll continue further from here. Now it requires default filters.php. So our settings.php, WP settings, it requires the default filters.php. So let's see what does it do. So it's in the WP includes directory, which adds many, not all, of the default filters and hooks. Let's open up. So we are looking for default filters.php. Here you go. So if you check, so many filters, hooks are defined over here, add filter, and these are the hooks, right? So many. Yeah, add action, add filter, all the filters and hooks are defined here. So which adds many, not all, of the default filters and hooks to the WordPress hook system. So whatever the WordPress needs, most of them are defined in this in terms of hooks and filters. This file goes hand in hand with the plugins.php loaded above together because these two files prepare the WordPress plugin API. So there are two files. One is this one, which is default filters.php. It has got all the add action, add filter hooks. So this file, in conjunction with your plugins.php, which is this, they together form the WordPress plugin API, because this file is won't be able to work without this file, because if you check, your add filter is defined over here, and this entire file is dependent on the add filter. Without this definition, it won't work. So add filter is being called over here and can't work without this file. So these two files work together and make the WordPress plugin API. Okay, and these both are included in WP includes folder or directory. Cool. Next, now WP settings checks to see if we are running multi-site. Let's close these two. So now it checks if we are running multi-site. And if we are, then it loads the msblocks.php, mssettings.php. msblocks and mssettings, and obviously these two as well. These two files act like WP settings.php, but handles setup specific to sites that have multi-site enabled in WP config.php. Okay, so basically the file that we're talking about, these files deal with the setting in case if it's related to multi-sites. Next, the value of short init is evaluated. Short init, okay, is evaluated, and if it is true, then the initialization is halted at this point. The constant was defined in WP initial constants function declared in default constant.php. So if you remember, if you go to default constants, short init, let's search it, short init, see, it's defined here. So this was defined in this file, and it's saying that in case if this is set to true, then the initialization will halt at this point. Okay, it was set to false previously, which means default value, if you check, is false, which means the initialization will not stop. But in case if someone makes it true, then the initialization of the WordPress will stop here. Okay, but how would that help? Why would someone want to stop the initialization at this point. So I'll tell you why. So setting this constant to true allows you to halt in initialization and only use the limited functionality loaded up at till this point, because there may be times that you need to access WordPress without loading all of its functionality. Using it as a file serving proxy in multi-site mode. That's an example. Okay. So if you don't want the initialization to happen uh, after this point, then you can set this to true into that file, default constant.php file, and then it will stop at this point. Initialization will stop. Okay. Next is it requires the l10n.php class wp local, class wp local switcher files, and localization and translation. So all of these files are included for localization and translation. The WP not installed defined above is called to run the installer. WordPress hasn't been installed. So this function is called, and where is it defined? It's defined in load.php. So this function is called to run the installer. WordPress hasn't been installed even after reaching this point. So if the WordPress installer has not been installed, then it installs it. And this function runs a few checks to see if certain variables and functions have been defined. If they haven't, that means WordPress hasn't been installed, and the initialization process dies, at which point you're redirected to installer install.php. So we check. So it dies over here. The site you've requested is not installed properly. Please contact your system administrator. Yep. And it redirects us to our install.php so that we can install a WordPress. So at this stage, we're checking if the WordPress is installed or not. If it isn't, then we will go ahead and direct the user to install.php to install WordPress. Otherwise, we'll just throw a error message, which is this. Okay, cool. Now, after this, it requires following files, which loads most of the WordPress core functionality. It's huge. There are over 40 functions. I mean, there are more actually. I mean, I haven't included them all. You can see there's a long list. And I'm really, guys, not going to go through each one of them, right? So what I'm going to do is I've written what all each function do. You can pause the video and read it out. So I'll just skip this part. Okay, cool. So what next? Next is it requires 3 additional functions, msfunctions.php. So it requires this, and this, which are multi-site specific files. So these files are related to your multi-site. So let's skip them. Then WP plugin directory constants, which was defined in default constant, is called. So this function is called, which is defined where? In default constants. Why is it called? What does it do? It sets up 7 constants for plugin to use. So let's go into this function. 7 constants. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 constants are set up. Why are they set up? Let's see. For plugins to use. So these constants are required by plugins. If you see plugin directory, plugin URL, plugin directories, all of these constants are going to be used by your plugin. So these 7 constants are defined here, so the plugin can use it. Next is now a for each loop to include must use plugins using wp get mu plugins. So after this function, we are running a for each loop. We are using this function, which probably must be containing some array of items, and we are including the required uh, files, I think. Yeah, actually plugins. So the for each loop is to include must use plugins using wp get mu plugins. Yeah. All right, guys. Um, so this basically runs a for each loop and includes the must use plugins using the wp get mu function defined in load.php above, which reads the location of the wp-mu plugin directory constant, which by default is set to wp content mu plugin, and loads any plugin that it finds. So basically, to sum it up, just runs a for each loop to include the required plugins. Next is, now another check is done to run to see if we are running multi-site. So again, a multi-site check is done, as you can see over here. We're checking that. And if we are, then another for each loop is executed to include the wp get active network plugins function, which was defined in msload.php, and loads any multi-site related plugins that are needed now from the wp plugin directory constant, by which by default is set to wp content plugin directory msload.php. Okay, let's move further. Now the majority of the plugin API has been set up, so the do action hook is called, is executed. So we've got our majority of the plugins loaded because we did the for each over here, we loaded the plugins, we did a for each over here for multi-site, we loaded the plugins. Now since all the plugins have been loaded, we'll call this hook. Okay. Then the wp cookie constant and wp ssl constant defined in default constant.php are called. So see this function, cookie constant and SSL constant. These two functions are called, what do they do? They guarantee that we have a unique hashes for our cookies and whether or not force admin and login SSL connections respectively. Okay. And once the cookies and SSL settings have been set, it requires var.php. So once these two settings have been done, then we require this file, which is vars.php. What does this do? Let's open vars.php and see. And you've guessed it right, it will be in wp includes folder. That's what we're dealing with. Got it. What does it do? First thing, it declares page now. What is page now? So page now always hold the location of the page that's currently being viewed. Okay, so if you go into any page and if you are trying to display that page, and if you define that constant and try to echo it out, it will tell you the location of that page which is being displayed. It tests to see what browser is being used to view the page and stores that in one of the series of 9 possible variables. Okay, we've got all of these variables. We are going to check as to which browser is being used. As you can see over Safari, MSC, Opera, Nav. So we're going to check which browser is being used, and basis that information will be stored into these constants respectively. So for Mac, it's going to be Mac IE, for Opera, is Opera, and things like that. How can you use that? These variables allow you to serve custom content to your visitors based on their browser from inside of your template files. So inside of your template files, you can probably run some condition that if you know what system this user is using. Is he using Linux? Is he using Mac? Is he using Opera? What browser system is using? and basis which you can, give him the functionality. If he's not using, for example, Mac, you don't want to give XYZ functionality. So that is for that. Okay. After browser detection, vars.php runs a few checks to determine what server software WordPress is running on, either Apache or IIS. So it checks over here. Yeah, checks over here Apache or IIS, which server WordPress is using. Then vars.php sets one final variable, is mobile. Let's see where it starts. Is mobile. Okay, it's set. This variable returns a boolean value, true or false, which will be set to true if the value of the server HTTP user agent matches any of the most common mobile browser. So what this is going to do is going to find out if the value of the $_server HTTP user agent is equal to and matches any of the most common mobile browsers, then it's going to return as true for this variable, is mobile. So it's going to tell us whether the user is using our site onto mobile or not. So maybe probably we'll give some functionality then. Yeah, cool. Next, then the following two functions are called. So which are those two functions? Create initial taxonomy and create initial post types. What does these two functions do? First of all, this one is defined in taxonomy.php. It sets up and initializes the default WordPress taxonomy. And the post type, it sets up the default post type, post pages, etc. I'll just check them one by one. So it's setting up the default taxonomies. Yeah, all of this. And this one, default post types. Okay. Right. Understand that whatever functions that we're calling at this point have already been included. Remember, we included these files. Yeah. So we've already got those functions included that we're calling here. Earlier we just included them and now we're calling them. All right. Cool. So the default in these two files will be run again on the init hook and executes at the end of WP settings. So in the init hook, it will be run again and will be executed. Okay. Cool. So we reached till here. And I think we should break it up for the next video because I think it's going to be too much then. All right. So I think we should recap. Yeah. So what we discussed, let's see. Yeah, we discussed from here that it requires the defaults filter.php located in WP include directory, which has got all the default filters and hooks. Yep. So we had our default filters which had all the filters and hook. Yep. And we also discussed that our plugins.php and default filters.php together form our WordPress plugin API because they go hand in hand. Yep. Now WP settings checks to see if we are running multi-site. Then it loads msblog.php, mssetting.php, and next the value of short init is evaluated, and the WordPress is halted at this point. Remember, evaluate this at this point is going to halt in case if we want the WordPress not to WordPress to be not initialized at this point, after this point, probably to run some checks. Then it requires all of these files for localization and translation. Then WP not installed is called to check if it is the WordPress is not installed. If it is not installed, then we direct the user to install.php, remember? Otherwise we throw an error message, remember? Yeah. Then all of these files are included, above 40 files that I asked you to, that I told you that you can, pause the video and see what it means. Yep. Then it requires msfunctions.php, default filters, all of this for multi-site specific files. Then WP plugin directory constants, which was defined default constant, which sets up 7 constants, remember? And all of these constants were for your plugin. Yep. And then we ran a for each loop to include our must use plugin files. And then we again did a multi site check and included the required plugins files. And then we also said that the majority of the plugin API has been set up. A do action hook is executed once all of these plugins files are included. And then these two functions, cookie constant and SSL constants, are called, executed, responsible for guaranteeing that we have unique hashes in our cookies and whether or not force admin and login SSL connections respectively. Then we required our vars.php, which defined page now, which gave us the location of the current page being viewed. Then we defined all of these variables, which included the information about which um, which browser the person was using. And then we define this variable is mobile to check if the if the user was using it on a mobile. And then we define these two functions, call these two functions, create initial taxonomy to initialize the default WordPress taxonomy, and post type to set up the default post types. Yep. So we're good till here, and in the next video we'll discuss further. Thank you very much.